In 1945, a young German soldier stepped through the gates of an American prisoner of war camp carrying fears that had been planted years before. He expected beatings. He expected humiliation. He expected revenge from an enemy he had been taught to fear above all others. Instead, he stopped and stared. There were guards, but there was also order. Food was being distributed. Medical personnel moved between prisoners. Rules existed. Routines existed. Nothing matched the nightmare he had imagined. Confusion replaced fear. Why were so many German prisoners shocked by what they found? The answer reveals a hidden story. The greatest challenge to Nazi propaganda did not come from bullets or bombs. It came from reality itself. Nazi propaganda during the war constructed a deliberate psychological barrier around the idea of surrender to the Allies. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, military briefings, and posters consistently portrayed captivity under American or British forces as brutal, degrading, and unforgiving. German soldiers were told that surrender was not a survival strategy, but an act of betrayal that would bring punishment not only upon themselves but shame upon their families and nation. This messaging was not random. It served a strategic purpose. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, leadership needed to prevent collapse of morale. Fear became a weapon of control, used to keep soldiers fighting long after rational military logic suggested withdrawal or surrender. Propaganda relied heavily on selective history, exaggerated enemy cruelty, and emotional manipulation rooted in national humiliation after World War I, combined with strict information control. Most soldiers had no access to independent verification of what actually happened to prisoners of war. The result was a generation of troops whose expectations of Allied captivity were shaped almost entirely by state-controlled narratives, leaving them unprepared for the reality they would eventually face in American hands. By the final years of the war, Germany was no longer fighting from a position of strength. Defeats accumulated across every front, from the collapsing eastern lines to the relentless pressure in the west. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and supply chains that once sustained the Wehrmacht began to fracture under sustained Allied bombing. Fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, and exhausted manpower created a battlefield reality that could no longer be hidden by propaganda. Yet even in this deteriorating situation, surrender remained psychologically difficult for many German soldiers. The fear of captivity, shaped by years of ideological conditioning, often felt as dangerous as the enemy itself. The strategic problem became clear in countless frontline units. Continue fighting a losing war, or risk entering a prisoner system they had been taught to believe was merciless. In some cases, entire formations delayed surrender despite having no realistic chance of survival, driven not by military logic but by fear of what came after capture. This was the hidden power of propaganda. It extended resistance beyond reason, turning survival itself into a psychological battlefield. These fears would only be challenged when soldiers finally encountered American captivity firsthand directly. This truth would only emerge after surrender itself revealed in the first hours after capture. Many German soldiers entered American custody expecting violence rather than procedure. Their references were years of propaganda that described Allied imprisonment as harsh, punitive, and humiliating. Instead, what they encountered was process, order, and restraint that many struggled to interpret in real time. Confusion was immediate, followed by suspicion that such treatment must be temporary or deceptive in nature. Some prisoners looked for hidden punishment behind routines, while others waited for violence that never arrived. Memoirs and interviews from former POWs repeatedly described the same realization that normal treatment itself became the shock. The greatest contradiction was not comfort, but the absence of cruelty they had been taught to expect. This emerging reality quietly dismantled assumptions built over years of ideological instruction. For many, it marked the first moment the propaganda narrative began to collapse under direct experience. The realization did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of undeniable observation. Each interaction, each routine check, and each orderly process deepened the sense that what they had been told was incomplete or false. What they feared most was not punishment, but the collapse of certainty itself. Now, American prisoner war camps during the Second World War operated under a structured system designed around order, regulation, and accountability. They were governed by strict administrative rules influenced by international conventions that defined minimum standards for treatment. Medical care, food distribution, sanitation, and housing were organized systematically to maintain stability within the camps. Work programs, recreational activities, educational classes, and religious services were introduced where conditions allowed. Camp administrators viewed this structure not only as a legal obligation but also as a strategic advantage in maintaining discipline. An overlooked dimension was how prisoners gradually observed aspects of American society through daily interaction and routine exposure. Through guards, newspapers, and operational procedures, German prisoners encountered evidence that challenged long-held stereotypes. For many, this created a quiet contradiction between expectation and lived experience inside the camps. The hidden battlefield was no longer physical but informational, shaping perception in ways propaganda had failed to anticipate. Each routine exchange, inspection, and administrative process reinforced a sense that reality inside American custody did not match wartime expectations. Weeks inside the system slowly eroded ideological certainty, replacing fear with cautious reassessment of what they had been told. For American authorities, this psychological shift was an unintended but significant outcome of maintaining disciplined camp conditions. Inside this environment, the true conflict was no longer between armies but between narrative and observation, where direct experience quietly dismantled years of constructed belief. American investment in prisoner of war camp systems was not driven by sentiment alone, but by a convergence of logistical necessity, military discipline, and long-term strategic calculation. As hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were captured across multiple theaters, the United States faced a practical requirement: how to contain, supply, and manage a rapidly growing population of enemy combatants without destabilizing operational priorities on the front lines. Organized camp systems reduced security risks, minimized escape attempts, and allowed military forces to remain focused on active combat zones rather than internal containment. At the same time, prisoner labor programs contributed to agricultural and infrastructure needs, easing domestic shortages during wartime mobilization. International reputation also played a significant role. Adherence to established conventions reinforced the image of a disciplined military power, strengthening diplomatic standing among allies and neutral observers. Within the camps themselves, structured treatment reduced unrest and created predictable behavioral patterns, making administration more efficient and lowering the risk of resistance. Cooperation increased when conditions were stable, and this stability also opened controlled channels of intelligence gathering, where prisoners voluntarily shared information under non-coercive conditions. The system demonstrated that humane treatment and strategic advantage were not opposing forces, but often aligned outcomes within modern warfare. What emerged was not a contradiction between morality and necessity, but a fusion of both into a single operational framework. This extension of battlefield logic into captivity policy revealed warfare operating beyond the front lines themselves, where strategy extended far beyond traditional battlefield boundaries and operational control systems. German propaganda had built a clear and terrifying image of American captivity. In that narrative, surrender meant suffering, humiliation, and near certain death. Yet prisoner accounts repeatedly described something that did not match those warnings. Many expected brutality, but instead encountered structured systems and consistent rules. Conditions varied, yet the gap between expectation and reality remained undeniable. For some, this contradiction became the first real crack in Nazi credibility. What they experienced in captivity directly challenged years of controlled messaging. The myth of uniform cruelty began to collapse under repeated observation. For many prisoners, reality became more persuasive than propaganda ever was. This widening gap destroyed confidence in the official wartime narrative. Captivity unintentionally became a moment of psychological revelation. For many soldiers, it marked the first undeniable evidence that their government had distorted reality. The collapse of belief did not happen instantly but through accumulated experience. Each day in camp reinforced a version of events that contradicted earlier fears. This slow erosion of certainty reshaped how prisoners interpreted the entire war. Over time, propaganda lost its psychological authority. Reality inside the camps became the decisive force in breaking ideological control. Truth replaced fear as a dominant guiding influence. Now, psychological aftermath began when certainty collapsed inside the minds of many German prisoners. What they had accepted as truth no longer matched experience, creating deep cognitive dissonance. Trust and authority weakened as prisoners reassessed everything they had been told. For some, captivity became a rare moment of reflection beyond ideology. The psychological struggle replaced the battlefield as the most important conflict. What emerged was an internal war between belief and reality that reshaped identity. As doubts accumulated, many prisoners began questioning not only propaganda but the entire system behind it. This quiet collapse of certainty became more powerful than any physical confrontation they had faced. Inside the camps, the most decisive battles were no longer fought with weapons but within the mind. In that internal space, propaganda lost its authority and experience became the only evidence that mattered. This marked the true turning point in perception for many soldiers. Now post-war testimonies from former German prisoners consistently describe a shared pattern of surprise and disillusionment after entering American custody. Memoirs, interviews, and personal recollections repeatedly reinforce that these reactions were not isolated experiences. Across numerous accounts, the same psychological shock appears again and again. The turning point was not a single moment, but an accumulation of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Reality ultimately defeated narrative control across these first-hand experiences. Each account strengthened the conclusion that propaganda collapsed when confronted with lived observation inside the camps themselves. Truth became undeniable only after experience replaced belief. System-wide confirmation emerged. German prisoners were not shocked because American camps represented perfection. War itself never produces perfection, and nothing inside captivity during a global conflict could ever be free from hardship or limitation. What shocked them was something far more fundamental: the distance between what they had been taught to expect and what they directly experienced upon arrival. For years, propaganda had constructed a world of absolute certainty, where the enemy was defined entirely through fear and distortion. Yet reality inside American custody operated on visible order, structure, and restraint that contradicted those expectations at every level. This story reveals a timeless principle that extends far beyond a single war. Propaganda can shape perception, it can influence decisions, and it can sustain fear for long periods, but it remains vulnerable the moment it collides with first-hand evidence that cannot be dismissed or rewritten. In the camps, that collision happened quietly, not through speeches or persuasion, but through daily observation and lived experience. The collapse of Nazi propaganda inside prisoner systems was not the result of argument or ideology. It was a result of repetition, routine, and comparison against reality itself. Over time, observation became stronger than belief, and experience replaced instruction as a dominant force shaping understanding.